Hey, my little night owls, welcome back. Get comfortable, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. Tonight we're diving into something more tragic than you'd expect from Tudor history. So before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what we do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Now let's ease into tonight's story together. In 1555, cannons fired across London. Bells rang in every church tower. Letters raced to Rome, to Spain, announcing the same miracle. England's queen had given birth. Except no baby ever cried. No infant was presented. In the birthing chamber, Mary Tudor sat in silence, her belly still swollen, her body still convinced it carried England's heir. The due date had passed weeks ago. Physicians whispered, courtiers paced, and slowly, celebration curdled into something darker. To understand that silence, we need to go back to what Mary believed was at stake. Mary Tudor's childhood was a masterclass in trauma dressed as royalty. Born in 1516, she started as England's beloved princess, legitimate, adored, the daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon. But then her father wanted a son, wanted Anne Boleyn, wanted to tear England away from Rome and Catherine's bed. Suddenly Mary wasn't a princess anymore. She was a bastard, an inconvenience, a living reminder of a marriage Henry had decided never existed. Her mother was banished, forbidden from seeing her daughter. Mary, just a teenager, was stripped of her title and forced to serve her infant half-sister, Elizabeth, the child of the woman who destroyed her family. She watched her father marry and discard wife after wife, watched the Protestant Reformation rip through England like a fever, watched everything she believed in get dismantled by men who smiled while they did it. Mary clung to her faith. Catholicism wasn't just religion for her, it was identity, resistance, proof that her mother's marriage had been valid, that she was legitimate, that God hadn't abandoned her, even when everyone else had. For years she lived in exile within her own country, pressured to renounce her beliefs, threatened, isolated, waiting. When Edward VI died in 1553 and Mary seized the throne against all odds, it wasn't just a coronation, it was a resurrection. She was going to undo everything, reconcile with Rome, restore the old faith, erase her father's sins. But none of it mattered if she died childless, because if she died without an heir, Elizabeth would inherit. Protestant Elizabeth, Anne Boleyn's daughter, the living symbol of everything Mary had suffered. The Tudor succession crisis shaped every breath Mary took. Her sister Elizabeth was next in line. Then Mary, Queen of Scots, another claimant. The throne was fragile. England's religious identity hung in the balance. A Catholic heir wasn't just desirable, it was essential. Without one, everything Mary fought for would die with her. So when she married Philip II of Spain in 1554, it was strategy wrapped in desperation. Philip was Catholic. Philip was powerful. Philip could give her the one thing she needed more than anything, a son who would keep England Catholic forever. Court politics exploded around the possibility. Catholic factions pinned all their hopes on a royal pregnancy. Protestant dissenters watched with dread. Spain calculated. Rome prayed. Everyone knew a royal pregnancy wasn't personal. It was the fate of a nation balanced on a woman's womb. Mary knew it too. She felt the pressure in every political meeting, every mass, every night she spent with Philip. Her body wasn't just her body anymore. It belonged to England, to God, to the future of the faith. And when the first signs of pregnancy appeared, hope didn't just flicker, it roared. In late 1554, Mary's period stopped. Then came the nausea, morning sickness that left her pale and shaking. Her belly began to swell, every symptom aligned perfectly. This wasn't wishful thinking. This was real. Her body was doing exactly what everyone had prayed it would do. Physicians examined her and confirmed what she already knew. The Queen was with child. Official announcements went out. Letters flew across Europe, carrying the news. Mary wrote to her cousin, the Holy Roman Emperor, barely able to contain her joy. Spain erupted in thanksgiving masses. Rome offered prayers. English Catholics exhaled for the first time in years. At court, everything shifted overnight. The Queen's pregnancy became the axis around which all activity revolved. Gifts poured in from noble families, hoping to secure favour. Tiny gowns were stitched by the finest seamstresses. Midwives were interviewed, vetted, selected. The birthing chamber was prepared with holy relics, blessed linens, and every safeguard Tudor England could provide. Astrologers were consulted. They calculated due dates, cast charts, predicted the child's temperament based on celestial alignments. Courtiers whispered about names. Would it be a boy? Almost certainly, they said. God wouldn't give Mary a daughter after all she'd endured. The child would be male, strong, Catholic, the future of England. Mary's body cooperated beautifully. Her breasts grew tender and full. Her belly continued to expand, rounding under her gowns. She felt movements inside her, quickening. That unmistakable flutter every pregnant woman recognizes. She was glowing, confident, certain that God had finally answered her prayers after decades of suffering. Foreign ambassadors sent dispatches home, confirming the pregnancy. The Venetian ambassador described the Queen's joyful demeanour. The imperial ambassador noted physical changes consistent with pregnancy. Betting pools opened in London, taverns about whether it would be a boy or girl, though most wagered on a son. Spain and England began negotiating the child's future titles, his education, his role in securing the alliance between the two kingdoms. It was real. It had to be real. The Queen herself believed it with every fibre of her being. Her ladies saw the swelling. Her physicians documented the symptoms. Her husband, though already growing distant, had done his duty. The timeline made sense, everything made sense. And why wouldn't Mary trust her body? Every sign pointed to pregnancy. The cessation of her courses, the sickness, the swelling, the movements she felt beneath her ribs. In an age before blood tests and ultrasounds, symptoms were the only diagnostic tool available, and Mary had all of them. Catholic Europe rejoiced. This wasn't just a royal birth, it was a miracle. God was blessing Mary's restoration of the true faith. The child growing inside her was divine vindication, proof that England's return to Rome was righteous. Protestant exiles in Europe watched with growing dread. They knew what a Catholic heir meant. Their cause would be lost. Elizabeth would never rule. The Reformation in England would be erased. Everything they'd fought for would vanish with Mary's son. The stakes couldn't have been higher, and as Mary's belly swelled through winter into spring, the entire continent held its breath. In April 1555, Mary entered her formal confinement. This was the ritual every royal woman underwent before giving birth. It wasn't optional, it was sacred protocol. The Queen would withdraw from public life into a specially prepared birthing chamber and remain there until after the delivery. The chamber itself was a carefully constructed sacred space. Heavy tapestries covered the walls, blocking draughts and prying eyes. Only one window was left partially uncovered, and even that was shrouded. Dim candlelight replaced daylight. The air grew thick with incense. Icons of the Virgin Mary covered every surface. Relics were placed around the bed. Fragments of saints' bones, blessed cloths, holy water in silver vessels. No men were allowed except priests. The Queen's world shrank to her ladies-in-waiting, her midwives and her confessors. These women would attend her in shifts, ready to spring into action the moment labour began. Midwives whispered instructions to each other, reviewing protocols they'd practiced for months. Linens were blessed, birthing stools were tested. Everything was prepared for the moment when Mary would push England's future into the world. Outside the chamber, the household restructured itself around the expected birth. Servants moved on tiptoe. Conversations were hushed. Laughter was discouraged. The entire palace held its breath. Protocols for the christening were reviewed again and again. Who would carry the child? Which nobles would stand as godparents? How would the announcement be made? London prepared too. Cannons were positioned and loaded. Bell ringers received their orders. The moment word came from the palace, the city would erupt in celebration. Messengers stood ready with pre-written letters to be dispatched to every court in Europe. The parchment sat on desks, waiting only for the date and sex of the child to be filled in. Public pageantry was already planned. Bonfires would be lit in every square. Free wine would flow. Te Deums would be sung in every church. This wasn't just a royal birth, this was a national event, the most important thing to happen to England in a generation. But there was another layer to the confinement rituals. They were also about control. Court gossip was ruthlessly policed. Speaking doubt about the pregnancy could be read as treason. Questioning the Queen's condition was dangerous. Even privately expressed skepticism could end careers, or worse. So no one questioned, not where it could be heard. The liturgical rhythms intensified. Prayers were said every hour. Masses were offered for safe delivery. Mary's confessor stayed close, hearing her confessions, offering spiritual comfort. The Queen prayed constantly, rosary beads slipping through her fingers, her lips moving in whispered Latin. The confinement wasn't just about preparing for birth, it was about transforming the Queen into a vessel of divine will, about framing the coming child as not just hers, but God's gift to England. Every ritual reinforced this, every prayer, every relic, every whispered blessing. And so Mary waited in her darkened chamber, surrounded by women and icons, and the scent of candles, convinced that any day now, any hour, the pains would begin, and England's Catholic future would be secured. The calendar tightened. Days counted down. The kingdom held its breath. The physicians had calculated everything. Based on when Mary's courses stopped, the quickening she'd reported, the progression of symptoms, they estimated late April, maybe early May at the latest. Astrologers consulted their charts and agreed. The stars aligned for a spring birth. Prayer lists were compiled and distributed to every monastery and convent in England. Everyone knew the date. April arrived. The birthing chamber hummed with readiness. Midwives checked supplies daily. Blessed linens were folded and refolded. Holy water was replenished. The Queen's ladies took turns keeping vigil, watching for the first signs of labour. Any moment now, they whispered. Any day. London was poised like a drawn bow. Bell ringers stood ready in every church tower. The moment word came from the palace, they'd begin. The sound would cascade across the city, announcing the miracle everyone had been waiting for. Messengers were stationed at intervals along every major road, ready to carry news to the far corners of the kingdom. Ships waited in harbour to sail for Spain, for Rome, for the imperial court. Letters sat on desks throughout the palace, pre-written except for the crucial details. It pleases Almighty God that Her Majesty the Queen has been safely delivered of a... The blank space waited. Prince or princess, date and time. Just fill it in and send. Simple. But the date came. And nothing happened. Reassurances were issued immediately. First births often run late, the physician said with practiced calm. The calculation may have been slightly off. These things are not precise sciences. The Queen is in excellent health. We simply wait upon God's timing. Hours became days. Days stretched into a week. The tension in the palace shifted from anticipation to something tighter, more fragile. Mary reported feeling movements, occasional pains even, but they never progressed into actual labour. The contractions, if that's what they were, would crest and fade without developing into anything more. Outside the birthing chamber, courtiers began to pace. They couldn't leave. Protocol demanded they remain close, ready to witness the birth and verify the heir's legitimacy. But the waiting was becoming torture. Whispered conversations started and stopped. Glances were exchanged. No one said the quiet part aloud. The bell ringers grew restless. How long were they supposed to stand ready? Messengers checked and rechecked their horses. The letters on the desks began to gather dust. Still, no word came from the Queen's chamber, except more reassurances, more waiting, more prayers. Mary inside the darkened room prayed harder. She consulted more relics. She had her confessor hear another confession, searching her conscience for any sin that might be delaying God's blessing. She felt the movements inside her belly. She was certain. The child was there. It simply wasn't ready yet. God was testing her patience, testing England's faith. May arrived. The due date was now officially passed, no matter how generously you interpreted the calculation. Physicians huddled in corridors, discussing possibilities in hushed tones. Perhaps the quickening had been misinterpreted. Perhaps the Queen's irregular courses had made the timeline unclear. Perhaps the child was simply large and needed more time. But privately, looks were exchanged. Worry lines deepened. Because every physician knew that pregnancies didn't just pause indefinitely. Labour either came or something was wrong. And the longer this silence stretched, the more wrong it felt. Still, no one dared say it to Mary's face. You don't walk up to a queen convinced she's carrying England's future and suggest otherwise. You wait, you pray, you hope you're wrong about the terrible certainty growing in your gut. The calendar kept turning, and still, no infant's cry broke the silence. The bells that had been ready to ring stayed silent. The cannons loaded and positioned across London remained unfired. The letters carefully drafted and waiting on desks throughout the palace were never sealed, never sent. And slowly, so slowly, you could almost pretend it wasn't happening. Celebration began to curdle into something else entirely. The court stopped asking when and started asking if. Not loudly, not openly, but the shift was unmistakable. Courtiers who'd been joyfully preparing for a christening now spoke, in careful, measured tones about the Queen's health. Ambassadors sending dispatches to their home courts changed their language from confident announcement to cautious hedging. Rumours bloomed like mould in the gaps where certainty used to be. Some said it was a divine test. God was seeing if England truly deserved a Catholic heir, if the faith was strong enough to wait without doubting. Others whispered darker theories. Perhaps this was punishment. God's judgment for the Protestant burnings that had already begun. Mary's bonfire policy bearing rotten fruit. The more paranoid Catholics suggested treason, witchcraft. Someone had cursed the Queen. Some hidden Protestant sympathiser had worked dark magic to steal the child from her womb. These accusations were dangerous, likely to end with someone being tortured for confessions they didn't have. But fear makes people vicious. Protestant pamphleteers abroad had a field day. Their printing presses worked overtime, producing satirical broadsides that were smuggled into England. God shows his hand, read one headline. The false Queen's false hope, read another. They called it divine proof that Mary's restoration was ungodly, that heaven itself opposed her reign. Inside the palace, physicians scrambled to control the narrative. They issued revised due dates. A miscalculation, they announced with all the authority they could muster. These matters are complex. The human body does not follow calendar mathematics precisely. They bought themselves time with medical jargon and careful deflection. But they were walking a tightrope over a pit. If they openly contradicted the Queen, if they suggested there was no pregnancy, they risked her wrath and possibly their positions or worse. But if they continued to validate her certainty and nothing happened, they'd look like fools or liars. Either way, they lost. Mary's isolation thickened like fog. She spent longer hours in prayer, her knees aching on the stone floor of her private chapel. Her rosary beads moved through her fingers so often they wore smooth grooves into her skin. She asked God why he was making her wait. What lesson was he teaching? What sin required this particular penance? Her ladies tried to comfort her. They brought her broth she barely touched. They read to her from devotional texts. They assured her that God's timing was perfect, that patience was a virtue, that the child would come when the child was ready. But their voices had started to sound hollow, even to themselves. Outside the birthing chamber, Protestant factions watched with barely concealed satisfaction. Every week without a baby was a week closer to Elizabeth's eventual succession. Every failed prediction was another crack in Catholic morale. They didn't need to fight, they just needed to wait. Catholic loyalists held the line publicly, defending their queen, insisting that any moment now the joyful news would come. But privately, morale was sagging. Faith requires evidence, and the evidence was becoming the absence itself. Spain's Philip sent carefully worded letters, diplomatic, measured, stripped of the warmth that had never really been there to begin with. He was already calculating his next moves, and none of them involved staying in England waiting for a phantom heir. And Mary's body? It kept lying to her. The swelling didn't recede. The sensation of movement continued. Her mind and her flesh were locked in a feedback loop, each one convincing the other that the pregnancy was real, even as the calendar screamed otherwise. Here's where the story shifts from political drama to something medically fascinating and deeply horrifying, because Mary wasn't faking. She wasn't lying. Her body genuinely believed it was pregnant. And that belief created real physical, measurable symptoms. It's called pseudocysis, phantom pregnancy, false pregnancy, hysterical pregnancy, though that term is outdated and dismissive. It's a documented medical phenomenon that still occurs today, though rarely, and it's not some medieval superstition. It's your brain and body conspiring in the cruelest possible way. The mechanics work like this. Extreme psychological stress combined with intense desire for pregnancy can trigger actual hormonal changes. The pituitary gland, your body's master control center, starts producing prolactin. That's the hormone responsible for milk production. Your hypothalamus gets confused signals. It starts behaving as if pregnancy has occurred, even though no embryo exists. What follows is a cascade of real physical symptoms. Menstruation stops. The body interprets the stress signals as pregnancy and shuts down the monthly cycle. Weight gain occurs, sometimes dramatically. The belly swells, not from a growing fetus, but from a combination of factors including gas, fat redistribution, and sometimes fluid retention. Breasts enlarge and become tender. In some cases, they even produce milk. Morning sickness is real. Nausea and vomiting occur because the hormonal disruption affects the digestive system. Food aversions develop. Fatigue sets in. The body is working overtime, trying to maintain a pregnancy that doesn't exist, and that effort is exhausting. Even fetal movements can be felt. Obviously, there's no baby kicking, but intestinal contractions, gas bubbles, and muscle spasms can create sensations that feel exactly like quickening to someone who's convinced they're pregnant. The mind interprets normal bodily functions as signs of life inside the womb. In Mary's case, every factor that could trigger pseudocysis was present and amplified. She was under unimaginable pressure. The fate of her religion, her legitimacy, her entire identity hinged on producing an heir. She desperately wanted to be pregnant. She believed she should be pregnant. She'd been told by everyone that pregnancy was her duty, her purpose, the only way to secure everything she'd fought for. Her faith played a role too. Mary saw pregnancy as divine, blessing, a gift from God vindicating her restoration of Catholicism. When the symptoms appeared, she interpreted them through that theological lens. This wasn't just biology, this was miracle, divine intervention, God answering her prayers after decades of suffering. The stress hormones flooding her system did the rest. Cortisol, adrenaline, all the chemical messengers your body produces under sustained pressure, they disrupted her endocrine system. Her pituitary gland started misfiring. Signals got crossed, and her body, trying desperately to fulfill what her mind demanded, created the symptoms of pregnancy. There were no blood tests in 1555, no ultrasounds, no way to measure hormone levels or visualize the uterus. Physicians relied entirely on external symptoms and patient reporting. And Mary had all the symptoms, every single one. Missed periods, check. Swelling belly, check. Breast changes, check. Morning sickness, check. Reported fetal movement, check. Tudor doctors had no framework for understanding pseudopsoriasis. They didn't know about hormones or the mind-body connection. They believed in the four humours, in wandering wombs, in divine intervention. When a queen told them she was pregnant and showed all the signs, they believed her. What else could they do? Modern understanding of pseudopsoriasis reveals just how powerful the mind-body connection really is. It's not metaphorical, it's biochemical. Your thoughts and emotions can literally reshape your physiology. The stress of wanting something desperately enough, of believing something intensely enough, can make your body produce symptoms that feel absolutely real because they are real, just not caused by what you think they're caused by. For Mary, living under constant scrutiny, her every symptom analysed by a nation holding its breath, that mind-body feedback loop became inescapable. Her body told her a story. Her mind believed that story. Her faith reinforced that belief. And her circumstances made questioning impossible. She wasn't delusional, she wasn't stupid. She was experiencing a genuine medical phenomenon that her body was producing and her era couldn't explain. The cruelest part, the symptoms don't just disappear when you want them to. Pseudopsoriasis can last months. Sometimes it only resolves when the body is forced to confront the absence through some external crisis. Like a due date passing, like false labour that leads nowhere, like the terrible silence where a baby's cry should be. In late May, something shifted. Mary felt contractions, real ones, or at least what felt real to her. Sharp pains radiating across her belly, tightening, releasing. The rhythm every woman in labour recognises. The birthing chamber erupted into controlled chaos. Midwives snapped into action, years of training taking over. Mary's ladies fluttered around the bed, adjusting pillows, bringing water, murmuring encouragement. Priests were summoned immediately. If the queen was about to give birth, last rites needed to be close at hand in case something went wrong. Maternal death in childbirth was common, even for queens, especially for first-time mothers in their late 30s. Word spread through the palace like wildfire. Courtiers who'd been drifting, exhausted from weeks of waiting, suddenly crowded the corridors again. This was it. Finally, the waiting was over. Soon there would be an announcement, a christening, a celebration to end all celebrations. The contractions came in waves. Mary gripped the bedposts, her knuckles white. She'd been taught that labour was woman's curse for Eve's sin, that pain in childbirth was divine punishment, but also divine design. She bore it stoically, or tried to. Sweat soaked through her shift. Her face went pale, then flushed, then pale again. Incense filled the room until the air was thick enough to taste. Candles burned at every surface. The midwives moved with practiced efficiency, checking Mary's progress, timing the pains, murmuring to each other in professional shorthand the Queen couldn't quite hear. Hours passed, night fell, candles were replaced, the pains continued, cresting and fading in rhythm. But something was wrong. The midwives exchanged glances. The contractions weren't progressing the way they should. Labour has stages, patterns. It builds, it intensifies. The cervix dilates, the body prepares to push. None of that was happening. Mary's contractions crested and faded without moving toward active labour. The midwives checked her again and again, trying to hide their confusion. Nothing was changing. The pains were real enough to make the Queen cry out, but they weren't doing anything. It was like her body was performing labour without actually labouring. Prayers intensified. Mary's confessor led the room in repeated Hail Marys. The ladies responded in unison. their voices rising and falling with the rhythm of the Queen's breathing. Outside the chamber, courtiers knelt in hallways, joining the prayers, begging God to bring the child safely into the world. Dawn came. Grey light filtered through the one partially uncovered window. Mary was exhausted, drenched in sweat, her face drawn with pain and confusion. She'd been labouring for hours. Why hadn't the child come? Why was God making her suffer without granting her the release of birth? The midwives huddled in whispered conference. This wasn't normal. They'd attended hundreds of births between them. They knew what labour looked like, how it progressed, what signs to watch for. This wasn't it. But how do you tell a queen that her body is lying to her? The physicians were called in, breaking protocol. Male doctors weren't supposed to enter the birthing chamber, but the situation was becoming desperate. They examined Mary as modestly as possible and confirmed what the midwives already knew. No dilation, no descent, no indication that actual birth was imminent despite hours of pain. They offered soothing reassurances. Sometimes labour stalls, Your Majesty. The child is strong, taking its time to prepare for the world. We must continue to pray and trust in God's timing. They prescribed more rest, warm compresses, herbal tinctures that did nothing. Morning stretched into afternoon. The pains finally began to ease, fading like tide going out. Mary lay back against the pillows, utterly spent. No baby, no blood, no rupture of membranes, no sign that anything had actually happened except the pain itself. The room fell silent except for whispered prayers and the crackling of candle flames. The ladies didn't know what to say. The midwives busied themselves tidying, avoiding eye contact. The priests continued their liturgy, filling the awful quiet with familiar words. And Mary, trapped in the darkness of that chamber, in the prison of her own body, began to understand something terrible. But she couldn't say it, couldn't even think it fully. So she prayed instead, harder than ever, begging God to explain what was happening to her. Outside the birthing chamber, the machinery of state was beginning to seize up. Someone had to say something. Someone had to issue a statement. But what could they possibly say? Official announcements shifted from confident declarations to careful diplomatic vagueness. The Queen continues in her confinement. Labour has begun but proceeds at God's pace. Prayers are requested throughout the realm for a safe delivery. Notice what's missing. No dates, no specifics, no concrete information whatsoever. Just bureaucratic fog designed to buy time. Philip's Spanish advisors urged maximum discretion. Spain had celebrated this pregnancy publicly. King Philip himself had written letters announcing the coming heir. If the pregnancy failed, if there was no child, Spain would look foolish. Worse, it would look weak, tied to a queen who couldn't deliver on the most basic dynastic requirement. They counselled careful management of information, no premature admissions, no public acknowledgement of problems. Just wait. English ministers faced a different calculus. They feared unrest. The common people had been promised an heir. Protestant factions were already spreading rumours. If the government admitted there was no baby after all, the celebration, after all the certainty, how would the people react? Would they riot? Would they turn against Mary? Would Elizabeth's supporters sense opportunity and attempt a coup? So they stalled. They issued vague updates. They asked for patience and prayers. They said everything and nothing. Foreign ambassadors were in an impossible position. Their job was to report accurately to their home courts. But what exactly were they supposed to report? The Queen was in labour, but not actually giving birth. The pregnancy seemed questionable, but no one would admit it. Each ambassador sent dispatches that contradicted the last one, trying to pass truth from what little information trickled out. The Venetian ambassador wrote that the Queen remained confident and that birth was imminent. 3 weeks later, he wrote that perhaps the calculations had been wrong. A month after that, his dispatches began using phrases like, "If there is a child, rather than when the child arrives. The imperial ambassador was slightly more direct but still cautious, noting that despite continued reports of pregnancy, no birth had occurred and none seemed forthcoming. Meanwhile, the celebrations that had been so carefully planned were quietly dismantled. The bonfires prepared for London squares were never lit. The free wine that was supposed to flow remained in casks. The letters drafted to announce the birth were destroyed or filed away. Gifts that had been prepared, tiny gowns and cradles and silver rattles, were returned to their donors or hidden in palace storage rooms where no one would have to look at them. It was like watching a parade in reverse, all the pomp and preparation being slowly, quietly undone. Messengers were released from duty. Bell ringers went back to their normal schedules. The cannons positioned around London were unloaded and returned to their regular stations. Mary's authority began to strain under the weight of what couldn't be said. A queen rules through a combination of divine right, legal legitimacy, and practical power. But all of that depends on perception, on people believing the narrative the crown projects. And the narrative of the pregnant queen delivering England's Catholic heir was collapsing in slow motion. Whispers in council chambers grew more pointed. How long could they maintain the fiction? What happened when the Queen finally emerged from confinement without a child? How would they explain it? What story could they possibly tell that wouldn't make everyone involved look like fools or liars? No one had answers, so they did what bureaucracies do best when faced with impossible situations. They delayed, they obfuscated, they issued statements that said nothing while sounding official. They managed the vanishing events by pretending it hadn't vanished yet, and they waited for something, anything, to break the terrible stalemate. While the court managed its careful dance of denial, the streets of London had already moved on to mockery. The common people had been primed for celebration. Ale had been purchased in anticipation of free-flowing revelry. Street vendors had stocked up on ribbons and commemorative tokens they planned to sell during the festivities. Work schedules had been cleared. Everyone expected a national holiday the moment the royal birth was announced. Instead, they got silence, then delays, then vague reassurances that fooled no one. The disappointment curdled fast. Streets that had been ready for bell peals now filled with dark jokes. Tavern songs mocked the Queen's swollen belly. Ballads whispered in alleys called her barren, cursed foolish. The English loved their monarchy, but they loved mocking it even more when given the chance. The Queen is pregnant with nothing but wind, went one popular jeer. Another crude rhyme suggested she'd been impregnated by her own desperate prayers, rather than her husband. The humour was cruel, sexual, pointed directly at Mary's most vulnerable spot, and it spread like fire through dry grass. For women, especially those who'd experienced pregnancy loss or infertility themselves, the Queen's situation inspired a strange mix of sympathy and schadenfreude. Some genuinely pitied her. They knew what it felt like to want a child desperately, to feel your body betraying you. Others, particularly Protestant women who'd lost family members to Mary's burnings, felt a grim satisfaction. Divine justice, they called it. God showing his hand. Protestant critics outside England weaponized the failed pregnancy with ruthless efficiency. Their printing presses worked overtime. Pamphlets flooded in from exile communities in Geneva, Strasbourg, Frankfurt. God's judgment on the false queen read one title. The barren fig tree cut down read another, citing the biblical parable Jesus told about fruitless trees being destroyed. They called it proof, undeniable divine proof that Mary's Catholic restoration was ungodly, that heaven itself opposed her reign, that God had looked at Mary Tudor and found her wanting. The phantom pregnancy became Exhibit A in the Protestant case against her legitimacy. John Knox, the firebrand Scottish reformer, preached sermons calling Mary's false pregnancy a sign of God's wrath against female rulers in general. His first blast of the trumpet against the monstrous regiment of women used Mary's failure as evidence that women were unfit to govern. The phantom heir was God's way of saying a woman's body couldn't be trusted with power. Even Catholic supporters struggled to maintain morale. They wanted to defend their queen. They wanted to believe they'd invested everything, emotionally, politically, sometimes financially, in Mary's restoration. But the silence from the palace was damning. How do you defend someone who won't acknowledge the obvious? Some Catholics tried to reframe it. This was a test of faith, they argued. God was seeing who would remain loyal, even when the expected miracle didn't arrive on schedule. Others suggested the devil was interfering, that Protestant witchcraft had somehow stolen the child from the Queen's womb. Desperate theories for desperate times. The Queen's personal shame mirrored a political crack spreading through the regime. Her entire identity had been built on legitimacy, on being the rightful heir, Catherine's daughter, the woman who would undo Henry VIII's sins. Producing a Catholic heir was supposed to be her vindication, her proof that God approved of everything she'd suffered and fought for. Instead, her body had betrayed her in the most public way imaginable. In front of ambassadors and nobles and common people and foreign powers, in front of everyone. The empty cradle wasn't just a private grief. It was a national humiliation. It was political ammunition for her enemies. It was a crack in the foundation of her authority that would never fully heal. Mary's image transformed in real time. Before the phantom pregnancy, she'd been the determined queen who'd seized power against overwhelming odds, the faithful daughter who'd restored England to Rome, the persecuted princess who'd endured and prevailed. Now she was becoming something else, the barren queen, the deluded woman whose body had lied to her, the Catholic ruler whose God wouldn't give her an heir, the childless monarch whose reign would end with her Protestant sister taking the throne. The cruelest part, Mary could feel it happening, even locked in her birthing chamber, even surrounded by loyal ladies and supportive priests. She could sense the shift, the way people's voices changed when they spoke to her, the careful avoidance of certain topics, the pity poorly hidden behind formal respect. She'd gone from celebrated to suspected to mocked, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Philip of Spain had never loved Mary. Let's be clear about that from the start. He'd married her because Spain needed England, because his father, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, had orchestrated the alliance for strategic reasons, because a Catholic England allied with Spain would reshape the balance of power in Europe. Philip was 27, Mary was 38. He was lean, conventionally handsome, raised in Spanish court splendour. She was visibly ill, worn down by years of stress and trauma, her body already showing signs of the illnesses that would eventually kill her. The marriage was duty, not desire, but Philip had done his duty. He'd visited her bed. He'd performed the necessary acts. He'd waited for the pregnancy that would secure his influence over England and produce a male heir who could inherit both kingdoms. When Mary announced she was pregnant, Philip played his role. He wrote letters announcing the joyful news. He made public appearances. He smiled. Then the due date passed, and nothing happened. Philip's absences grew longer and more frequent. He'd never stayed in England continuously to begin with. He had responsibilities across his empire, letters to answer, territories to manage, but now his visits became perfunctory, brief, formal. He'd arrive, spend the minimum required time, and leave again. His letters to Mary changed tone. Gone was even the pretense of affection. They became diplomatic correspondence, updates on political matters, requests for English support in Spanish conflicts, carefully worded but emotionally empty, like writing to a business partner rather than a wife. Mary, meanwhile, was desperate for him. Her letters to Philip during this period are painful to read. She begged him to return. She wrote about how much she missed him. She framed her suffering in terms he might understand, political terms, suggesting that his absence was damaging her authority and therefore Spanish interests in England. She told him she was praying for his safety, that she dreamed of him at night, that his presence would cure her melancholy. The subtext was clear: I need you. Please don't abandon me. Please prove I'm not as alone as I feel. Philip's responses, when they came, were polite and distant. He had pressing matters in the Low Countries. Spain required his attention. He would return when circumstances permitted. In other words, not anytime soon. Mary blamed herself. If only she'd produced the heir, Philip would stay. If only her body had cooperated, he'd have reason to remain. The phantom pregnancy hadn't just failed to secure the succession, it had exposed the transactional nature of her marriage in a way she couldn't ignore. Philip's advisors were already calculating next moves that didn't include Mary. England without an heir was England with an expiration date. Mary would die eventually. She was clearly ill, and Elizabeth would inherit. Protestant Elizabeth, who would immediately reverse the Catholic Restoration and likely break the Spanish alliance. Spain needed to prepare for that reality. Intimacy, what little there had been, evaporated completely. Mary slept alone. Philip, when he was in England at all, maintained separate chambers and spent his time with his Spanish entourage rather than with his wife. Every interaction was filtered through diplomatic protocol. The marriage became a shell. Mary's longing collided with Philip's cold pragmatism at every turn. She wanted a husband. He'd only ever offered a strategic partnership. She wanted partnership. He'd only ever offered the minimum effort required to maintain appearances, and the empty cradle sat between them like an accusation. The child that would have bound them together, the heir that would have made their marriage matter beyond politics, the son who would have given Philip reason to stay, and Mary proof that God blessed their union. Gone, or rather, never there to begin with. Mary understood on some level that she'd been used, that Philip had married her for England, not for her, that his affection, such as it was, depended entirely on her utility, and when her body failed to deliver that utility, his interest evaporated. The phantom pregnancy hadn't just humiliated her publicly, it had destroyed the one intimate relationship she'd hoped might offer comfort. She was alone. Again. Still. Always. And then, impossibly, the symptoms returned. In early 1557, roughly 2 years after the first phantom pregnancy ended in silence and shame, Mary felt familiar signs. Her period stopped again. Nausea returned. The swelling began. And against all logic, against everything experience should have taught her, hope flooded back. This time would be different. That's what she told herself. That's what she had to believe. God had tested her faith with the first pregnancy. She'd failed that test somehow, harboured doubt, or committed some sin that prevented the birth. But she'd learned. She'd prayed more. She'd suffered more. Surely now God would reward her. The court's reaction was more muted this time. When Mary announced she believed herself pregnant again, there were no bells, no premature celebrations, no letters racing across Europe, just careful acknowledgement. The Queen reports signs consistent with pregnancy. That was the official line. Notice the hedging. Reports signs, not is pregnant. The language had changed, but Mary hadn't changed. She felt the same certainty she'd felt before. Her body was giving her all the signals, the same symptoms, the same swelling, the same sensations. How could this be false again? Surely God wouldn't be so cruel as to let her suffer the same delusion twice. This had to be real. Catholic loyalists tried to reinvest emotionally, though the effort was visible. They wanted to believe. They wanted Mary to have her heir. They wanted the Catholic Restoration to have a future. But the memory of the first failure hung over everything like fog. Hope this time was fragile, tentative, guarded. Skeptics watched with a mixture of pity and grim expectation. They knew how this would end. The pattern was already clear. The Queen's body would betray her again. Time would pass, no child would come, and the silence would return. They didn't say it aloud, but the thought was there in every careful statement, every diplomatic letter, every sideways glance. Protestant observers barely hid their schadenfreude. "Oh, she's doing it again," they whispered. The deluded Catholic queen, pregnant with nothing but desperation. They prepared their pamphleteers, their satirists, their preachers. When this pregnancy failed, and it would fail, they'd have fresh material to work with. Mary framed it as mercy, divine mercy. God had put her through the trial of the first false pregnancy to strengthen her faith, and now he was granting her a second chance. She told her confessors that this was proof of God's love, that he hadn't abandoned her after all, that everything she'd suffered had been preparation for this moment. Her ladies nodded and murmured agreement, though some of them exchanged worried glances when Mary wasn't looking. They'd been through this before. They'd seen the swelling, heard the Queen describe movements, witnessed the false labour. They knew what was coming. But what could they say? You don't contradict a Queen's certainty about her own body. You support, you pray, you hope you're wrong, even though you know you're not. Official communications were extremely guarded this time. No announcements to foreign courts, no preparations for christenings, no public pageantry. Just quiet acknowledgement that the Queen believed herself, with child and time would tell. Spain's response was even more cautious. Philip barely reacted. He didn't rush to England. He didn't write passionate letters. He simply noted the information and continued with his other business. He'd been through this before too. He knew better than to invest hope in Mary's body. The court mechanically went through the motions. Midwives were contacted again, though with less enthusiasm. Clergy prepared prayers, though they felt like echoes of prayers that hadn't worked the first time. The birthing chamber was readied, though everyone remembered what happened in that room last time. Mary doubled down on ritual. More prayers, more masses, more confessions, more relics arranged around her bed. If faith alone could manifest a child, Mary's faith was strong enough to create an entire nursery. But bodies don't work that way. Faith doesn't override biology, and deep down, buried beneath the hope and the certainty and the religious conviction, some part of Mary must have known, must have felt the terrible familiarity of it all, the same symptoms producing the same delusion, her body lying to her again in exactly the same way. But she couldn't admit that, not to herself, not to anyone. So she smiled and prayed and prepared for the child she wanted so desperately to exist. When Mary entered her second confinement in March 1558, the birthing chamber felt different. The same tapestries hung on the walls, the same relics were arranged around the bed, the same candles burned with the same incense, but the air was heavier, thicker, weighed down by memory and dread. This time, Mary knew what waiting felt like. She knew the long hours of silence punctuated by false hope. She knew how days stretched into weeks, while nothing happened. She'd lived it before, and some part of her, the part she tried desperately to silence, suspected she'd live it again. So she doubled down on faith. If her first confinement had been pious, this one was obsessive. She prayed constantly, her lips moving in whispered Latin from dawn until she collapsed in exhausted sleep. Her rosary beads never left her hands. She wore grooves into them from constant use. More relics were brought in, fragments of saints' bones, pieces of the true cross, vials of holy water from Rome, blessed cloths that had touched sacred shrines. The chamber became less a room and more a shrine, crowded with objects meant to channel divine power. If sheer accumulation of holy things could force God's hand, Mary was prepared to try. Her confessor practically lived in the room. She confessed daily, sometimes multiple times a day, searching her conscience for any sin that might be preventing the birth. Had she been proud, wrathful? Had she taken pleasure in the burning of heretics when she should have felt only righteous sorrow? She excavated her soul, looking for the flaw that was keeping God from blessing her. The physicians hedged even harder this time. They'd been wrong before, or rather, they'd validated something that turned out to be wrong, and they were terrified of repeating the mistake. But openly contradicting the Queen would mean admitting their first diagnosis had been false, that they'd either lied or been incompetent. Neither admission would end well for their careers, so they performed examinations and spoke in careful medical language that committed them to nothing. Her Majesty presents symptoms consistent with pregnancy. The body shows signs that might indicate conception. We await further developments. Every statement was a hedge. Every pronouncement contained an escape route. Rumours outside the chamber grew darker. This wasn't just divine judgment anymore. This was something worse. Some whispered about demonic interference, that Satan himself was stealing England's Catholic heir to ensure a Protestant succession. Others suggested the Queen had been cursed by Protestant witches. That dark magic was at work. Catholic theologians debated in universities and monasteries. Was this a test? A punishment? A trial like Job's? What did God intend by giving the Queen the symptoms of pregnancy without the reality? Some framed it as a call to deeper faith. Others saw it as a warning that England hadn't sufficiently purged its Protestant heresy. Protestant pamphleteers had already started their presses. They were waiting for the inevitable failure so they could flood England with mockery. The deluded Queen, pregnant again with nothing but wind and wishes. God's judgment repeated for those too blind to see it the first time. London's mood was wary and fatigued. The city had been through this before. The raised hopes, the waiting, the crushing disappointment. No one wanted to invest emotional energy in celebrating prematurely. No one wanted to look foolish again. So the city went quiet, watchful, sceptical. Mary's ladies maintained their vigil, but the strain showed. They'd attended the first confinement with hope and excitement. This time, they attended with duty and dread. They knew what watching their queen suffer looked like. They'd seen it before, and now they were watching it again, unable to help, unable to tell the truth, trapped in a performance that everyone knew would end badly. The chamber felt smaller this time, more claustrophobic. The walls pressed in. The incense was suffocating rather than comforting. The candlelight seemed dimmer. Everything that had felt sacred during the first confinement now felt desperate. And Mary, at the centre of it all, prayed harder than she'd ever prayed, begged God louder than she'd ever begged, bargained with heaven for the miracle she needed. If you give me this child, Lord, I will build more churches. I will burn more heretics. I will do anything you ask. Just please, please let this be real. But her body was lying to her again, and this time part of her knew it. The due date arrived. Again. And nothing happened. Again. The physicians had learned their lesson about specific predictions, so this time they'd been vague. Late spring was all they'd committed to, but even late spring has limits. May became June. June stretched toward July, and the birthing chamber remained silent, except for prayers that were starting to sound hollow, even to those reciting them. Mary reported the same signs as before, movements inside her belly, occasional contractions that felt like labour beginning. But just like the first time, the contractions never progressed. They'd crest and fade without leading anywhere. Her body was performing the same cruel theatre it had performed before. The false signals came with crushing regularity. Every few days, Mary would feel pains sharp enough to alert the midwives. Every time, the chamber would brace for labour to begin, and every time, after hours of waiting and praying and hoping, the pains would dissipate into nothing. It was torture by repetition. The same hope raised and dashed over and over, like being forced to relive the same nightmare on a loop. Each false alarm made the next one harder to believe in, but Mary couldn't stop believing, couldn't stop hoping, couldn't admit what everyone else already knew. Court communications practically collapsed under the weight of disbelief. What were they supposed to say this time? They'd already used all the diplomatic language, all the careful hedging, all the medical excuses. The Queen continues in her confinement, awaiting God's timing, only works so many times before it becomes obvious, code for nothing is happening and nothing will happen. The few announcements that did go out were masterpieces of saying nothing while appearing to say something. Her Majesty remains in good spirits and faith. Prayers continue to be offered throughout the realm. No mention of due dates, no mention of progress. Just vague reassurance that technically contained no false information. International observers stopped even pretending to believe. Ambassadors' dispatches were blunt now. The Venetian ambassador wrote plainly that no pregnancy existed and likely never had. The imperial ambassador noted the pattern and concluded that the Queen was either deluded or suffering from some illness that mimicked pregnancy symptoms. The French, who had always been sceptical, said openly that England was being ruled by a barren woman living in fantasy. Dynastic urgency spiked across Europe. If Mary couldn't produce an heir, and clearly she couldn't, then England's succession was about to shift dramatically. Protestant England under Elizabeth would reshape European politics. Catholic powers needed to prepare. Spain needed to recalculate its entire strategy. France needed to position itself for advantage. Everyone was making contingency plans. Mary's private despair became impossible to hide. Her ladies reported that she wept more often, that her prayers took on a desperate, pleading quality, that she sometimes sat for hours staring at nothing, her hands resting on her still swollen belly, her face blank with grief. But she wouldn't leave the chamber, wouldn't admit defeat. Even as weeks stretched into months and the summer heat made the enclosed room unbearable, she stayed. Because leaving meant acknowledging that there was no child, that there had never been a child, that her body had betrayed her twice in exactly the same way. The psychological impact was devastating. The first phantom pregnancy could be explained as a mistake, a medical anomaly, even a divine test, but two identical failures? That suggested something deeper, something broken, either in her body or in God's plan for her or in reality itself. The second failure also confirmed what her enemies had been saying all along, that Mary was cursed, that her womb was barren, that God opposed her reign. One phantom pregnancy could be dismissed. Two created a pattern, proof, her opponents said, of divine judgment. When Mary finally emerged from the birthing chamber in late July 1558, there was no announcement, no explanation, no acknowledgement that anything had happened or failed to happen. The court simply resumed its normal functions, as if the last 4 months hadn't occurred. But everyone knew. Everyone had watched it happen again. The same symptoms, the same waiting, the same crushing absence where an heir should have been. And this time, there was no possibility of hope remaining. Mary was 42 years old and visibly declining. There would be no third chance, no more confinements, no more waiting for a miracle. The future of England now belonged to Elizabeth. The phantom pregnancies didn't just destroy Mary personally, they reshaped the entire political landscape of her reign. Every decision made in the shadow of that empty cradle was coloured by desperation and approaching doom. Succession worries immediately pivoted to Elizabeth. Mary had spent years trying to avoid naming her Protestant half-sister as heir. She'd searched for alternatives. She'd considered other claimants. She'd hoped desperately that her own child would make the question moot. But without an heir of her body, Elizabeth was the obvious successor by both law and blood. Mary's council grew pragmatic in ways that must have hurt her deeply. They started making preparations for the transition they could all see coming. Not openly, not in ways that could be called treasonous, but letters were written, contacts were made. Key nobles began quietly reaching out to Elizabeth's household, hedging their bets. The Catholic restoration that Mary had fought so hard to achieve suddenly looked temporary, fragile, doomed. Without a Catholic heir to inherit, everything she'd accomplished would be undone the moment she died. Her counsellors knew it. Foreign powers knew it. Mary herself knew it, and that knowledge made everything more desperate. The burnings intensified. Over 280 Protestants were executed during Mary's reign, and a disproportionate number died in the final years. After the second phantom pregnancy ended, the pace of executions increased. Some historians see this as Mary lashing out in grief and rage. Others suggest she was trying to stamp out heresy completely before time ran out. Her public justification was always religious. These people were heretics threatening England's souls. Their executions were acts of love, meant to save others from damnation. But the timing suggests something more complex. A woman racing against her own mortality, trying to accomplish her mission before her Protestant sister inherited and undid everything. Financial strain became acute. The celebrations prepared for both phantom pregnancies had cost money. The political instability around succession made it harder to raise funds. The war with France, which Mary had been drawn into because of her Spanish alliance, was bleeding the treasury dry. Parliament watched all of this with increasing concern. MPs measured their loyalty carefully. They'd supported Mary's religious policies when it seemed like she'd secure a Catholic succession. But now, they started calculating, positioning themselves, thinking about survival under the next reign. Religious policy stayed aggressively Catholic on the surface. Reconciliation with Rome continued. Protestant worship remained illegal. The old rituals were enforced, but underneath, everyone could feel the structure weakening. Like a building whose foundation was crumbling, it still stood, but for how long? The loss of Calais to France in January 1558 was both military defeat and symbolic catastrophe. Calais was England's last continental territory, a remnant of medieval imperial glory. Losing it was humiliating, and it happened on Mary's watch, just months after her second phantom pregnancy ended. To her enemies, it looked like more evidence of divine judgment. Even God's military favour had abandoned her. Mary's personal involvement in governance declined. She'd always been conscientious, attending council meetings, reviewing documents, making decisions. But after the second failure, she withdrew. Illness played a role, certainly, but so did despair. What was the point of governing a kingdom that would be handed to her enemies the moment she died? The machinery of state continued functioning, but without her driving energy. Ministers made decisions, councils met, policy was implemented. But the guiding vision, the passionate commitment to Catholic restoration that had animated the early years of her reign, flickered and dimmed. Everything operated in the shadow of emptiness. The empty cradle, the absent heir, the future that would never arrive. And everyone, from Mary herself down to the lowest clerk, knew that the clock was running out. The phantom pregnancies didn't just break Mary's heart, they wrecked her body in ways she never recovered from. After the second confinement ended, the swelling in her abdomen didn't fully recede. Modern scholars looking at contemporary descriptions suspect she had an ovarian tumour or uterine cancer. The swelling, the pain, the hormonal disruption that created pregnancy symptoms, all consistent with gynecological cancers. In the 16th century, there was no way to diagnose such things. No surgery to remove tumours, no treatment beyond. Prayer and herbal remedies that did nothing. Observers noted chronic pain. Mary moved more slowly. She winced when she sat or stood. She held herself carefully, like someone whose body hurt with every motion. The Spanish ambassador wrote that the Queen suffered from swelling and retention of water that left her face puffy and her body bloated. Edema, fluid retention, classic signs of organ failure. She couldn't sleep. Insomnia plagued her nights. She'd lie awake in her chambers staring at the darkness, her mind churning with everything that had gone wrong. When she did sleep, she had nightmares, woke sweating and disoriented. Her ladies reported hearing her cry out in the night. Depression deepened into something clinical. Mary had always been melancholic. The Tudor family had a streak of mental illness running through it, but this was worse. She lost interest in things that used to bring her pleasure. Music, reading, even prayer sometimes felt like going through motions, rather than genuine communion with God. Somatic symptoms spiraled. Headaches that left her bedridden for days, nausea unrelated to pregnancy, dizziness, weakness. Her hands trembled, her vision blurred. Every bodily system seemed to be breaking down at once. Modern medical understanding suggests she was experiencing the compound effects of multiple conditions, possible ovarian or uterine cancer causing the swelling and pain, stress-induced hormonal disruption from years of trauma and pressure, depression causing physical symptoms, and the simple fact of being a chronically ill woman in her 40s with no access to effective medical care. Stress physiology played a massive role. When your body is under constant stress, psychological, emotional, physical, it starts eating itself. Cortisol floods your system continuously. Your immune function drops, inflammation becomes chronic, wounds heal more slowly, sleep disruption makes everything worse. You enter a feedback loop where stress causes illness, which causes more stress, which worsens the illness. For Mary, already fragile from a lifetime of trauma, the phantom pregnancies were the final assault. Her body had been pushed past its limits, first with the hope and hormonal disruption of pseudocysis, then with the crushing disappointment and grief, then doing it all over again. The psychological impact alone was enough to cause physical breakdown. Her work capacity narrowed dramatically. She struggled to attend full council meetings, couldn't focus on documents for long periods, had trouble remembering details of conversations. Her ministers noticed and began making decisions without her input, then presenting them for her approval. She'd become a figurehead in her own government. Decision-making slowed to a crawl. Things that should have been resolved quickly dragged on for weeks, not because Mary was incompetent, but because she was exhausted, physically, mentally, emotionally drained. She didn't have the energy for the constant vigilance that ruling required. Irritability spiked. She snapped at advisors who'd served her faithfully for years. She lost her temper over minor issues. She accused people of disloyalty when they were simply trying to help. Pain and depression make you mean. Make you lash out at the people closest to you because they're the only ones safe to rage at. She withdrew from public life almost entirely, stopped making ceremonial appearances, stopped attending pageants and celebrations. The few times she did appear publicly, people were shocked by how ill she looked, how much weight she'd lost, or in some areas, gained from the swelling, how old she seemed. The vibrant, determined woman who'd seized the throne in 1553 against overwhelming odds had faded into a shadow. That woman had been fueled by righteous anger and absolute certainty. This woman was broken, sick, grieving losses that couldn't be named or mourned publicly. The court watched her decline with a mixture of pity and calculation. Some genuinely grieved for their queen. They'd served her loyally and loved her personally, but others were already looking past her, already preparing for Elizabeth, already deciding how they'd position themselves in the next reign. And Mary, trapped in a body that kept failing her, could only watch herself fade while knowing her enemies waited like vultures for the end. While Mary's body betrayed her repeatedly, Elizabeth waited with the patience of someone who'd learned survival early. Elizabeth had spent her entire life walking a tightrope. Her mother, Anne Boleyn, had been executed when Elizabeth was 2. She'd been declared a bastard, just like Mary before her. She'd survived her father's paranoia, her brother's Protestant tutors, and Mary's Catholic restoration. She'd learned one crucial skill: how to survive by being invisible until the moment came to step forward. During Mary's phantom pregnancies, Elizabeth played her role perfectly. Outward obedience, visible compliance. She attended court when summoned. She knelt in the right places. She said the right prayers, or at least appeared to. She wore modest clothing. She kept her household small and unintimidating. She did everything possible to avoid giving Mary a reason to see her as a threat. But behind that careful performance, Elizabeth was absolutely preparing. Her household, though small, was staffed with brilliant minds. William Cecil, her future chief minister, was already in her service. She cultivated relationships with Protestant sympathisers carefully, through intermediaries who could deny everything if caught. Letters passed through coded channels. Elizabeth maintained plausible deniability about everything. If you'd searched her correspondence, you'd find nothing treasonous. Just a loyal sister writing respectful letters to her queen. But the networks she was building, the contacts she was making, the intelligence she was gathering, all of it was preparation for a crown she couldn't acknowledge wanting. Mary sensed it. How could she not? She'd watch Elizabeth during court functions and see the calculation behind her half-sister's downcast eyes. She'd hear reports of people visiting Elizabeth's household and wonder what they discussed. She knew that every day she failed to produce, an heir was a day Elizabeth's future grew more certain. Trust frayed inside council chambers. Mary grew suspicious of advisors she'd relied on for years. Were they still loyal to her, or were they already making contingencies for the next reign? She couldn't be sure. And that uncertainty poisoned relationships. Some nobles and ministers began cultivating discreet contact with Elizabeth. Not openly, not in ways that could be called treasonous, but a friendly letter here, a gift there, a message conveyed through a mutual friend. Just enough to establish that when the transition came, they'd been wise enough to prepare. Foreign courts were even less subtle. The French had always preferred Elizabeth. A Protestant heir meant a weaker England, allied with Protestant powers, rather than Catholic Spain. Ambassadors began sending more reports about Elizabeth's activities. Diplomatic gifts found their way to her household. The continent was already treating her as the heir apparent. Philip of Spain, Mary's own husband, began considering his options. If Elizabeth inherited, his influence in England would evaporate. He needed a strategy. Perhaps he could marry Elizabeth himself after Mary died. The idea was floated, though it went nowhere. Elizabeth had no interest in being Spain's puppet queen. Mary saw how men looked past her, how their eyes would flick to Elizabeth when they thought the queen wasn't watching, how conversations would pause when she entered a room, as if they'd been discussing something she wasn't meant to hear. She felt herself becoming irrelevant in real time. The future was sharpening around her while she faded. Elizabeth was young, healthy, intelligent, and crucially, not Catholic. She represented everything Mary had fought against, everything Mary's mother had lost, everything that had caused Mary decades of suffering. And there was nothing Mary could do to stop it. No heir meant no Catholic succession. No Catholic succession meant Elizabeth inherited. The law was clear. Blood and legitimacy favoured Elizabeth. Unless Mary could somehow disqualify her or produce a miracle child, the future belonged to her Protestant half-sister. Elizabeth's survival calculus was simple. Outlast Mary. Don't provoke. Don't rebel. Just wait. And with each passing month of Mary's decline, the waiting grew easier. The shadow heir was stepping into the light, slowly, carefully, inevitably. When everything else failed Mary, her body, her husband, her political goals, faith remained. It was her last fortress, her final refuge, the one thing no one could take from her, even as they took everything else. Mary's spirituality had always been central to her. Identity. During her years of exile under her father and brother, when she'd been stripped of title and forced to conform to Protestant practice, her Catholic faith was the only thing that told her she was still legitimate, still her mother's daughter, still Catherine of Aragon's rightful heir. When the world said she was nobody, her faith said she was chosen. That faith intensified after the phantom pregnancies. If her body had failed her, it was because God was testing her. If her marriage was empty, it was because earthly love paled beside divine love. If her reign would end with a Protestant successor, it was because God worked in mysterious ways, and she had to trust his plan. Her daily routine became almost entirely liturgical. She attended Mass multiple times a day, morning, noon, evening. Her household chaplains structured time around prayers, matins, lauds, vespers, compline. The hours sanctified, made holy, made bearable through ritual. Confession became daily, sometimes more. She'd examine her conscience obsessively, searching for sins that might explain her suffering. Had she been proud when she took the throne, wrathful toward heretics when she should have felt only righteous sorrow? Had she loved Philip more than God? She excavated her soul, looking for the flaw. Her confessors assured her she was not being punished. They framed her suffering as participation in Christ's passion. She was being given the privilege of suffering like Jesus suffered. Her pain had meaning. It was redemptive. It was bringing her closer to God and helping save England's soul. This theology was both beautiful and brutal. It gave meaning to meaningless suffering, but it also trapped her in suffering. Because if pain is sacred, you can't escape it without seeming to reject God's plan. You have to endure, accept, find purpose in agony. Mary did find purpose. She framed her entire reign through this lens. The burnings weren't cruelty, they were love, saving souls by destroying heretical bodies. The phantom pregnancies weren't humiliations, they were tests of faith. Her childlessness wasn't failure, it was God's mysterious will. This framework sustained her, it truly did. Without faith, Mary would have collapsed completely. The rituals, the prayers, the theological certainty, they gave her something to hold on to when everything else was slipping away. But faith also bound her to hope's vicious cycle. Because if suffering is redemptive, if God is testing you, then you have to keep believing. The next prayer will be answered. The next confession will unlock the mystery. The next ritual will earn the miracle. You can't give up without admitting God has abandoned you. And for Mary, that admission would have destroyed her completely. So she prayed harder than she'd ever prayed, begged louder than she'd ever begged, bargained with heaven, offered everything she had and everything she was. If you give me a child, Lord, I'll build more churches, burn more heretics, restore more monasteries, do anything you ask, just please don't leave me childless and powerless and remembered as the queen who failed. The relics in her chambers multiplied, fragments of saints, pieces of the true cross, blessed medals and rosaries, holy water from sacred sites. She surrounded herself with tangible connections to the divine, as if proximity to holiness could force God's hand. Her religious writings from this period reveal a woman trying desperately to make sense of suffering that had no sense. She wrote about submission to God's will, about trusting in divine wisdom, about accepting that earthly sorrows bring heavenly rewards. She was writing theology to survive by, and it worked in its way. Faith kept Mary standing when her body wanted to collapse. It gave her reason to get up each morning. It told her that her suffering mattered, that her reign mattered, that she mattered even when the world suggested otherwise, but it couldn't give her what she wanted most. It couldn't make her body cooperate. It couldn't produce the heir she needed. It couldn't stop Elizabeth from inheriting. Faith was her fortress, but even fortresses fall. Tudor physicians thought they understood pregnancy. They were catastrophically wrong, but they were confident. That's the dangerous combination. Their framework was the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile. They believed health depended on keeping these fluids balanced. Too much of one or too little of another caused illness. Pregnancy, they thought, required a specific balance. Enough heat to cook the seed, enough moisture to nourish it, enough blood to build the child. When Mary presented with pregnancy symptoms but didn't deliver a child, her physicians scrambled for explanations within their framework. Perhaps her womb was too dry, not moist enough to sustain life, Or maybe too cold, insufficient heat to bring the pregnancy to term? They prescribed warming foods, hot compresses, herbal remedies meant to adjust her humoral balance. Some suggested her womb had wandered. This was a genuine medical theory. They believed the uterus could detach and move around inside a woman's body, causing all sorts of problems. A wandering womb could explain pregnancy symptoms without actual pregnancy. The treatment? Strong-smelling herbs to lure the womb back into place. It sounds absurd now, but they were serious. Others blamed corrupted blood or bad air. The theory of miasma, disease caused by foul air, was popular. Perhaps the queen had been exposed to contaminated air that poisoned her womb, or perhaps her blood had become corrupted, too thick or too thin to sustain a child. Midwives had their own folk knowledge, often more accurate than the male physicians' theories. They knew what pregnancy looked and felt like from attending hundreds of births. They could tell when something was wrong, but they had no authority to contradict the university-educated doctors who insisted they understood women's bodies better than women themselves did. Divine explanations were everywhere. Was this a test from God? Punishment for sin? A demonic curse? Theological debates raged in universities. Some argued that Mary's suffering was like Job's, a test of faith that would ultimately be rewarded. Others suggested it was divine judgment for sins the Queen hadn't adequately repented. The witchcraft angle was taken seriously. Some Catholics genuinely believed Protestant sympathisers had cursed the Queen. That dark magic had stolen the child from her womb or prevented conception in the first place. Accusations flew. Investigations were launched. People were questioned about whether they'd used spells against the Queen. Modern medical understanding points to pseudopsysis, as we've discussed. The mind-body feedback loop creating real symptoms without real pregnancy. But modern doctors also consider underlying conditions that could have contributed. Ovarian tumours can cause abdominal swelling, hormonal disruption, missed periods, even the sensation of movement. So can large uterine fibroids. Both conditions would have been undiagnosable in the 16th century and could have created symptoms that looked exactly like pregnancy. Prolactinoma, a tumour of the pituitary gland that causes excess prolactin production, can stop menstruation and cause breast changes. It can also trigger psychological symptoms including depression and anxiety. This would explain both the physical symptoms and Mary's emotional state. Severe endometriosis can cause many of the same symptoms: chronic pain, abdominal swelling, disrupted cycles, hormonal imbalances. Women with endometriosis sometimes experience pseudopsysis because their bodies are already behaving abnormally. Some historians have suggested Cushing's syndrome, caused by excess cortisol. This can cause weight gain, fluid retention, mood changes, and menstrual disruption. Given the extreme stress Mary was under, it's plausible her body was producing excessive cortisol. The truth is, we can't definitively diagnose someone who died over 450 years ago. We have descriptions in letters and chronicles, but they're filtered through the medical misunderstandings of the time and often written by people who'd never examined Mary personally. They're using language we have to interpret, describing symptoms that could indicate multiple conditions. What we can say with certainty: Mary suffered from something that created pregnancy symptoms without pregnancy. Whether it was purely pseudopsysis or pseudopsysis triggered by an underlying gynecological condition, we'll never know for sure. The limits of retroactive diagnosis matter. They remind us to be humble about what we can claim to know. They also remind us that Mary lived in an age that couldn't help her, even if doctors had correctly diagnosed her condition. There was no surgery, no hormone therapy, no psychiatric medication, just theories and prayers and treatments that ranged from useless to actively harmful. She suffered in an age that couldn't explain or treat what was destroying her. While Mary suffered privately, her public reputation was being carved in stone, and the sculptors were her enemies. Satire poured from Protestant printing presses in exile. Geneva, Strasbourg, Frankfurt, anywhere English Protestants had fled, they set up presses and produced pamphlets mocking their Catholic queen. The phantom pregnancies gave them perfect ammunition. Divine judgment made visible, God showing his hand. One popular pamphlet depicted Mary as a barren tree being cut down, referencing Jesus' parable about fruitless fig trees. Another showed her belly swollen with demons instead of a child. The imagery was grotesque, sexual, designed to humiliate. They weren't just attacking her policies, they were attacking her body, her womanhood, her most intimate failures. Sermons in Protestant regions called her cursed. Ministers preached that a woman who burned the faithful couldn't expect God to bless her womb, that heaven itself had closed against her, that her childlessness was proof positive that her reign was ungodly and temporary. The Bloody Mary persona was already forming. She'd earned the nickname through her persecution of Protestants. Over 280 people burned at the stake during her 5-year reign. But now the epithet fused with her childlessness. In cultural memory, she became the barren queen who burned heretics, the woman whose womb was as dead as her victims. Folklore began to grow around her. Stories spread that she'd tried to fake a pregnancy by smuggling in a substitute baby, that she'd killed infants in occult rituals trying to conceive. None of it was true, but truth mattered less than narrative. The story people wanted to believe was of a desperate, cruel woman whose body rejected her the way God rejected her reign. Loyal chroniclers tried to soften the edges. Catholic writers focused on her piety, her legitimacy as Henry VIII's eldest daughter, her devotion to restoring the true faith. They framed the phantom pregnancies gently, as mysterious afflictions or divine mysteries not meant for human understanding. They emphasized her suffering as noble, Christ-like. But even sympathetic accounts couldn't erase the phantom pregnancies. The silence where a royal birth should have been echoed too loudly. The empty cradle was too central to ignore. Even friends had to acknowledge what had happened, though they tried to frame it charitably. Enemy chroniclers sharpened every edge. They lingered on the grotesque details, the swelling that wouldn't recede, the public humiliation of missed due dates, the second pregnancy that proved the first wasn't an accident, but a pattern. They made Mary's body a battleground, turning medical trauma into political ammunition. The failed pregnancies became shorthand for a failed reign. A woman who couldn't even fulfill her biological role, how could she possibly govern a kingdom? The logic was viciously circular and entirely gendered. Male kings could be childless without their legitimacy questioned. But for Mary, her barren womb became evidence of her unfitness to rule. Contemporary accounts started describing her differently. Where once they'd praised her determination and piety, now they emphasized her decline. She was described as melancholic, sickly, prematurely aged. Her swollen belly, which had been celebrated as proof of pregnancy, was now described as evidence of disease. The same body, but the narrative had flipped from hope to horror. Letters between ambassadors and foreign courts crystallized the shift. Early in her reign, she'd been Her Catholic Majesty, by God's grace, Queen of England. By 1558, she was the childless queen, or simply Mary. The modifiers changed. The respect faded. She was being written out of importance, even before she died. The reputation began to outrun the facts. Mary's reign was complex. She restored church property, tried to reform currency, struggled with Parliament over her Spanish marriage. But all of that was getting flattened into a simple story. Bloody Mary, the childless tyrant who burned Protestants and whose God punished her with a barren womb. History, written largely by her enemies and her successors' supporters, wasn't kind. The nuance disappeared. The phantom pregnancies, which should have evoked sympathy for a suffering woman, instead became jokes, proof of divine judgment, a national embarrassment. And Mary, still alive and ruling, could read this shift in real time, could feel herself becoming a cautionary tale before she'd even died. By spring 59-58, Mary was visibly dying. The phantom pregnancies had broken something in her that couldn't be repaired. Now her body was simply giving up. The symptoms intensified dramatically. Fever came in waves, burning through her until she was drenched in sweat, then leaving her shivering under piles of blankets. The swelling in her abdomen grew worse. Not better. It pressed against her ribs, made breathing difficult, turned every movement into agony. Modern doctors looking at contemporary descriptions strongly suspect ovarian or uterine cancer, possibly advanced endometrial cancer that had metastasized. But influenza was also raging through England that spring, an epidemic that killed thousands. Mary may have contracted it, her already weakened immune system unable to fight off the infection. Fever, body aches, respiratory distress, all consistent with severe flu. Whether it was cancer or flu or both working together to destroy her, the result was the same. She was dying. Then came news that broke something in her that illness hadn't yet touched. Calais had fallen to the French. England's last continental possession, held for over 200 years, lost on Mary's watch. She reportedly said that when she died, they'd find Calais written on her heart. The military defeat compounded her personal ones. Every front was failure. Grief over Calais accelerated her physical decline. She stopped eating properly, stopped attending council meetings, stopped pretending she had the strength to govern. Her ministers realized they were essentially running the country without her, making decisions and simply informing her afterward. She'd become a ghost haunting her own reign. The council began preparing for the transition of power with increasing openness. They couldn't wait any longer. Mary was clearly dying. Elizabeth needed to be ready to take over smoothly, or England risked chaos. Letters were drafted in advance. Procedures were established. The machinery of succession started turning while Mary still lived. But they kept it secret from her as long as they could. No one wanted to tell a dying queen that her government was already planning for her replacement, that her councillors were reaching out to her Protestant sister, that the Catholic restoration she'd fought for was about to be dismantled the moment she took her last breath. Mary knew anyway. She could feel it in how people spoke to her, how servants looked at her, how conversations stopped when she entered rooms. She was dying, and everyone was waiting for her to finish. She began making her final arrangements. Letters to Philip, though he hadn't visited in months. Letters to her household, thanking them for their service. Letters to Pope Paul IV, asking him to continue supporting English Catholics after she was gone. Bequests to her ladies, instructions for her burial. She wanted to be interred beside her mother, Catherine of Aragon, whose body had been moved to Peterborough Cathedral. Her will was detailed. She left money to her servants, requested masses be said for her soul, asked Philip to protect English Catholics and maintain the alliance with Spain. She knew he wouldn't. He'd already moved on to other political calculations, but she asked anyway. The confessions intensified. She spent hours with her priests, reviewing her life, seeking absolution for sins real and imagined. She'd burned Protestants. Had she been right? Would God see her actions as righteous defense of the faith, or as cruelty masked as piety? She wrestled with it, even at the end. She also confessed her secret fears, that Elizabeth would undo everything, that England would return to heresy, that her mother's honour would be forgotten again, that she herself would be remembered as a failure. Her confessors assured her that she'd fought the good fight, that God would judge her intentions, not just her results. Final acts of devotion filled her last days. She received communion daily, had relics brought to her bedside, prayed constantly when she had the strength. Her rosary beads never left her hand. Even when fever made her delirious, her fingers moved through the familiar pattern of prayers. She accepted what was coming. No heir was coming to save her legacy. No miracle was going to reverse her fortunes. No last-minute divine intervention. Just the slow, painful, shutdown of a body that had already suffered too much. In November 1558, as autumn turned cold and grey, Mary Tudor prepared to die. She'd lived 42 years, ruled for 5, failed at the one thing she'd needed most to succeed. And now, the end was here, bringing neither peace nor vindication. Just silence. The succession she'd tried desperately to prevent was about to happen. Elizabeth was coming, and there was nothing Mary could do to stop it. Mary Tudor died on November 17th, 1558, at St. James's Palace in London. It was early morning, around 6 o'clock. She was 42 years old. The end came quietly. No dramatic last words recorded for posterity. No scene of deathbed reconciliation or curse. Just a woman worn out by illness and disappointment, slipping away in the grey dawn. Her ladies were with her. Her confessors had administered last rites. She died as she'd lived her final years, surrounded by Catholic ritual, her faith the only comfort left. Within hours, everything changed. The court that had orbited around Mary for 5 years pivoted on its axis. Seals were broken, official proclamations were drafted at lightning speed. Messengers mounted horses and raced toward Hatfield House, where Elizabeth waited. The same bells that had stayed silent during the phantom pregnancies now rang out, announcing the old Queen's death and the new Queen's accession. Elizabeth was proclaimed Queen that same day. No delay, no dispute. The succession everyone had been quietly preparing for became official reality. The Queen is dead, long live the Queen. The formula hadn't changed, only the Queen's had. Immediate steps followed established protocol. Mary's body was prepared for lying in state. Her household received formal notice that their service had ended. Wages would be paid. Positions would be filled by Elizabeth's people. Thank you for your service, now leave. The machinery of transition was brutally efficient. The household reoriented toward Elizabeth with remarkable speed. Servants who'd attended Mary began making overtures to Elizabeth's staff, hoping to keep their positions. Nobles who'd supported Catholic policies suddenly remembered they'd always had Protestant sympathies. Political survival required quick pivots, and most people pivoted. Allies of Mary's reign scrambled. Some fled to the continent, knowing Elizabeth's Protestant government would view them with suspicion. Others stayed and tried to negotiate their place in the new order. A few genuinely mourned, most calculated their next moves. The birthing chamber, prepared twice for a child who never came, was stripped of its sacred trappings. The relics were removed. The blessed linens were folded and stored. The candles were extinguished. It became just another room in the palace, its purpose erased. Soon it would be repurposed, given to someone in Elizabeth's household, its history forgotten by everyone, except those who'd witnessed Mary's suffering there. Mary's funeral was held on December 14th, nearly a month after her death. She was buried in Westminster Abbey, not beside her mother, as she'd requested. That wasn't politically convenient for Elizabeth. The funeral was Catholic. One last gasp of the old rites before Elizabeth's Protestant settlement took hold. Latin prayers were said. Incense filled the abbey. Then it was over. Elizabeth didn't attend her sister's funeral. She sent representatives, made appropriate gestures, but stayed away. Some historians read this as grief. Elizabeth had her own complicated feelings about Mary. Others see it as pragmatism. Why emphasize continuity with a reign she was about to systematically dismantle? The court changed completely within weeks. Mary's counsellors were replaced. Her religious advisors were dismissed or arrested. The Spanish ambassador was treated coolly. Catholic priests began quietly leaving England or going underground. Protestant exiles started returning, welcomed as heroes. It was like watching a building being demolished and rebuilt simultaneously. The structure of government remained: councils, courts, administration. But the people and policies changed completely. Elizabeth's reign began not as evolution from Mary's, but as revolution against it. And Mary, she was buried, memorialized in the minimum required way, then set aside. Her reign became a cautionary tale almost immediately. The 5 years of Catholic restoration were framed as an unfortunate interruption in England's Protestant destiny. Her accomplishments were minimised. Her failures were amplified. The woman who'd fought so hard to secure her throne, restore her faith, and produce an heir was reduced to a footnote, a name in the list of monarchs between her brother Edward and her sister Elizabeth. Important mainly for what came after her, not for what she'd done herself. The quiet ending became historical erasure. When Elizabeth I rode into London as England's new queen, the city exploded with relief so palpable you could practically taste it. Bells rang. For real this time. Crowds lined the streets cheering. Protestant exiles who'd been living abroad for years began streaming home, returning to a country that had tried to burn their faith out but failed. The mood was jubilant, triumphant. England was Protestant again. The nightmare, as they saw it, was over. For Catholics, the mood was darker. Some grieved genuinely for Mary. She'd been their champion, their hope for restoring the faith. Others feared what Elizabeth's accession meant for them personally. Would there be reprisals? Would Protestant mobs target Catholic households? Would they face the same persecution Mary had inflicted on Protestants? The answer, mercifully, was mostly no. Elizabeth would prove far more tolerant than her sister. She wasn't interested in burning people for their beliefs. She wanted religious conformity, certainly. She'd established the Anglican Church as England's official faith, but she wouldn't make martyrs the way Mary had. Her approach was political rather than ideological. Conform outwardly, believe whatever you want privately. Don't cause trouble, and you'll be left alone. Policy reversals began immediately. The reconciliation with Rome was dissolved. Papal authority was rejected. Monasteries that Mary had restored were closed again. Protestant liturgy was reintroduced. The Book of Common Prayer returned. Latin was replaced with English in churches. Everything Mary had fought to establish was dismantled in months. The burnings stopped. This alone made Elizabeth popular. England was exhausted from religious violence. The Marian persecutions had created Protestant martyrs whose stories would be told for centuries. John Fox's Book of Martyrs would document every burning in gruesome detail, cementing Mary's reputation as Bloody Mary. Elizabeth, by ending the executions, positioned herself as the merciful alternative. Foreign courts reset their strategies completely. Spain lost its foothold in England the moment Mary died. Philip II briefly considered proposing marriage to Elizabeth, keeping his connection to the English crown. But Elizabeth had no interest. France, which had always preferred a Protestant England to a Catholic one allied with Spain, saw opportunity. Every power in Europe recalibrated around the new political reality. Elizabeth's religious settlement was deliberately moderate. She didn't swing England to radical Protestantism the way some reformers wanted. She established a middle path, Protestant theology, but retaining some Catholic ritual elements. It satisfied neither extreme, but kept most people from open rebellion. Pragmatism over purity. Culturally, Elizabeth began a process of image-making that would transform how England saw itself. She positioned herself as Gloriana, the Virgin Queen married to her kingdom. Where Mary had tried and failed to produce an heir, Elizabeth made her childlessness a strength. She didn't need a husband or children. England itself was her legacy. The contrast with Mary was deliberate. Elizabeth was young where Mary had been aging, vigorous where Mary had been sickly, triumphant where Mary had been tragic. The new regime worked hard to emphasize the difference. This was a new beginning, they insisted. The dark years were behind them. Mary's story started being written by her successor's triumph. History is written by winners, and Elizabeth won. She'd survived her dangerous youth, outlasted her sister's persecution attempts, and inherited the throne through sheer patience and political skill. Her 44-year reign would be remembered as England's golden age, the Elizabethan era. Shakespeare, exploration, naval victory over Spain, cultural flourishing. Mary got 5 years and phantom pregnancies. Elizabeth got nearly half a century and eternal glory. The comparison was unfair but inevitable. Mary had inherited a divided kingdom in crisis. Elizabeth inherited the same kingdom, but with better luck and better health. Mary faced impossible expectations and a body that betrayed her. Elizabeth faced those expectations and deftly sidestepped them by refusing to marry. But in the immediate aftermath of Mary's death, the prevailing emotion was simply relief. The childless Catholic Queen was gone. The Protestant heir had ascended. England could move forward, and Mary, buried in Westminster Abbey, became a memory to be managed rather than a queen to be honoured. Mary Tudor left behind documents, lots of them, official proclamations, letters to foreign monarchs, council records, treaties. The machinery of state produces paper, and that paper survives in archives across Europe. But what's missing tells you as much as what's there. Where is Mary's voice? Ambassador reports describe her from the outside. The Venetian ambassador noting her swollen belly. The imperial ambassador commenting on her melancholic temperament. The Spanish ambassador reporting on her health and her desperate love for Philip. But these are external observations, men watching a queen and writing what they saw, filtered through their own assumptions and political interests. Her official letters are formal, diplomatic, carefully constructed. They reveal policy, but rarely emotion. We, Mary, by the grace of God, Queen of England, France and Ireland. The royal plural, the ceremonial language, the distance between the woman and the crown she wore. You can read dozens of these letters and never feel like you know the person who wrote them. Personal letters are rarer. A few survive to Philip, painful in their neediness. She misses him. She wishes he would return. She frames her loneliness in political terms. His absence damages her authority, but the personal longing bleeds through. These letters hurt to read because they show a woman trying to maintain dignity while begging her husband to care. Letters to her cousin, the Holy Roman Emperor. Letters to the Pope. Letters to her council. All carefully worded. All aware that they might be read by others, copied, forwarded, analysed, nothing truly private, nothing unguarded. Chronicles written during her reign describe events but not interior life. They tell you what Mary did, when she did it, who was present. They don't tell you what she felt, what she thought in private moments, how she processed the trauma of her childhood or the humiliation of the phantom pregnancies. Catholic apologists wrote after her death, trying to salvage her reputation. They emphasised her piety, her legitimacy, her devotion. They made her a martyr to the true faith, persecuted by Protestant lies. But even friendly chroniclers couldn't erase the phantom pregnancies. They dealt with them awkwardly, uncomfortably, minimising where they couldn't ignore. Protestant chroniclers did the opposite. They lingered on every humiliating detail, the swelling, the false labour, the public celebrations that turned to mockery. They used her medical trauma as proof of divine judgment. These accounts give you detail, but through a lens of cruelty. Personal piety artifacts hint at interior life. Mary's rosary beads worn smooth, her prayer books, margins filled with notes, reliquaries she commissioned. These objects suggest a woman whose faith was deeply felt, constantly practiced, central to her identity. But they can't tell you what she prayed for in specific moments. What bargains she tried to make with God. What doubts she harboured. Historians read between the lines, trying to glimpse the woman behind the crown. They note when letters stop, suggesting periods of illness or depression when Mary couldn't write. They track patterns in policy decisions, inferring emotional states from political choices. They compare descriptions across multiple sources, triangulating truth from contradictory accounts. The phantom pregnancies appear in the record as gaps and silences as much as events. Announcements of pregnancy followed by nothing. Due dates mentioned then quietly abandoned. Celebrations prepared then cancelled without explanation. The absence itself becomes the evidence. Mary's own words about the phantom pregnancies, if she ever spoke or wrote about them directly, don't survive. No diary entry saying, "I don't understand what's happening to my body." No letter to a confidant explaining her confusion and grief. Either she never articulated it that way, or those documents were destroyed, or they've been lost. The phantom child exists in the record as permanent absence. The baby who was announced but never born. The heir who was prepared for but never arrived. The cradle ordered but never filled. Negative space where a prince or princess should have been. Gaps in the record matter. They show us what was too painful to document, too private to share, too dangerous to admit. Mary suffered in ways that left traces but not testimony. We know something terrible happened. We can describe the symptoms and the consequences, but her own experience of it, her interior life during those awful months, remains largely hidden. History gives us the outline. The gaps give us the humanity. Bloody Mary stuck. Of all the Tudor monarchs, Mary I got saddled with the nickname that followed her into legend, and eventually, bizarrely, into bathroom mirrors. The epithet started during her lifetime. Protestant pamphleteers used it to describe her persecution of heretics. Over 280 people burned at the stake in 5 years. The numbers were real. The fires were real. The screaming was real. John Fox's Book of Martyrs, published shortly after Mary's death, documented every execution in graphic detail. Illustrations showed people burning alive, their faces twisted in agony. The book became a bestseller, required reading in many Protestant households. The name Bloody Mary fused persecution with personal tragedy in cultural memory. She wasn't just the queen who burned Protestants, she was the childless queen who burned Protestants. The barren woman whose phantom pregnancies proved God opposed her even as she lit bonfires for the faithful. The two narratives intertwined until they became inseparable. Compare this to how other monarchs are remembered. Henry VIII executed far more people than Mary. Estimates range from 50,000 to 72,000 over his reign. But he's remembered as larger than life, charismatic, a cultural icon, 8 wives, Renaissance prince, founder of the English Church. His brutality gets softened by time and mythos. Elizabeth I also executed people for religious and political reasons. Catholics under her reign faced persecution, though usually less overtly brutal than Mary's burnings. But Elizabeth became Gloriana, the Virgin Queen. Good Queen Bess. Her violence gets framed as necessary statecraft rather than cruelty. Mary alone got bloody, partly because Protestant England wrote the history. Winners determine reputations, but also because her reign was short, unsuccessful, and ended with her Protestant sister undoing everything she'd accomplished. She didn't get decades to build alternative legacies. She got 5 years, phantom pregnancies, and an early death. The legend simplified everything. The complex religious and political situation that led to the burnings got flattened. Mary's genuine theological conviction, she truly believed burning heretics saved souls, was erased in favour of depicting her as cruel. Her personal suffering disappeared. The phantom pregnancies became jokes rather than tragedies. Over centuries, folklore took the name and ran with it. Ghost stories emerged. Mary's spirit haunting mirrors, a vengeful queen searching for the child she never had. The urban legend of Bloody Mary, summoned by chanting her name in a darkened bathroom, is a modern invention, but it draws on older associations. The childless queen, the woman who dealt in death, the mirror as portal to something dark and female and dangerous. the folklore is revealing. It transformed a historical queen into an archetype, the wronged woman, the barren mother, the vengeful spirit. Mary became less a person and more a symbol of feminine rage and loss. The phantom pregnancy, her most personal trauma, became central to the mythology. The ghost queen searching eternally for the baby who never existed. It's macabre. It's also deeply sexist. Male monarchs become legends of power and achievement. Female monarchs, especially those who failed by gendered expectations, become cautionary tales or ghost stories. Mary couldn't produce an heir, so folklore turned her into an eternal seeker of lost children. The name obliterated nuance. Mary was intelligent, well-educated, politically skilled. She survived years of danger before taking the throne. She reversed multiple coups. She governed during constant crisis. She tried to reform currency, restore church property, navigate impossible international politics. None of that matters to popular memory. Popular memory knows. Bloody Mary burned Protestants. Phantom pregnancy. Died childless. The end. Even sympathetic modern historians struggle against the weight of the legend. They can present evidence of Mary's complexity, her context, her humanity, but Bloody Mary is sticky. It's dramatic. It's memorable. It's been reinforced through centuries of Protestant English culture that needed a Catholic villain. The phantom pregnancies became a macabre touchstone. They're what makes Mary's story tragic, rather than just tyrannical. They humanise her in a painful way. Here was a woman who suffered immensely, while also confirming the judgment. Here was a woman whose body proved God opposed her. Strip away the legend and you find a woman. Put it back and she disappears again under layers of myth, ghost story and bathroom mirror chants. The real Mary Tudor died in 1558. Bloody Mary will haunt mirrors forever. Before she was Bloody Mary, or the childless queen, or the Catholic tyrant, Mary Tudor was a daughter, a girl, a teenager watching her world collapse, a woman trying to survive. The crown came later. The humanity was there first. Mary was Catherine of Aragon's daughter. That defined everything. Catherine had been Henry VIII's first queen, his longest marriage, the mother he genuinely loved before ambition and dynastic anxiety destroyed everything. Mary grew up watching her mother's dignity under impossible pressure. Catherine never admitted the marriage was invalid, never stopped calling herself queen, never stopped insisting Mary was legitimate. That kind of stubborn resistance became Mary's inheritance. She watched her mother die in exile, forbidden from seeing her daughter. That grief shaped Mary permanently. It wasn't just loss, it was injustice. Her mother had done nothing wrong except fail to produce a son, and for that, she'd been cast aside, her marriage annulled, her daughter declared a bastard. Mary saw exactly what happened to women who couldn't deliver male heirs. She saw it in her mother's tragedy. Then she lived it in her own. As a wife, Mary was painfully vulnerable. She loved Philip in a way he never reciprocated. Her letters to him reveal someone desperate for affection from a man who viewed her as a political arrangement. She was 11 years older, visibly ill, ruling a kingdom he'd married into for strategic reasons. The power imbalance was cruel. Mary had the crown, but Philip had youth, health, and the freedom to leave, which he did repeatedly. As a believer, Mary was sincere to the point of self-destruction. Her faith wasn't performance, it was the core of her identity. When she burned Protestants, she genuinely believed she was saving England's soul. Modern sensibilities recoil from that correctly, but understanding her requires acknowledging she acted from conviction, not mere cruelty. She thought heresy was a disease that would damn the kingdom eternally. Burning heretics was surgery, horrible but necessary. The cost of being watched by a nation during private pain is something we can barely imagine today. Every symptom of her phantom pregnancies was analysed by ambassadors and reported to foreign courts. Every missed due date became international news. Every day without a birth was another day of public speculation about what was wrong with her body. Paparazzi culture has nothing on Tudor court gossip. She had no privacy, no space to grieve or process trauma without an audience. Her birthing chamber was attended by ladies, midwives, priests, and outside the door, courtiers waiting for news. When the news never came, their whispers followed her. She couldn't escape being watched, being judged, being found wanting. Gendered expectations weaponized maternity in ways male monarchs never faced. Henry VIII had no male heir for years. He was never called Baron. He divorced and executed wives, blaming them for his reproductive failures. Edward VI was a child and therefore not expected to produce heirs. Philip II of Spain had multiple marriages and produced children eventually, but failures were blamed on his wives, not him. Mary had no one to blame but herself in the eyes of her contemporaries. Her body was her responsibility. Her phantom pregnancies weren't medical mysteries to be pitied. They were failures, evidence that God opposed her, proof she couldn't fulfill her most basic duty as a queen. Bodily autonomy versus dynastic duty. Mary's body was never fully hers. It belonged to the state, to the future, to the need for Catholic succession. She couldn't choose not to try for children, couldn't opt out of the physical and psychological torture of failed pregnancies. Her body was a political battlefield, and she lost. What empathy restores to the record is this: Mary Tudor suffered. Not abstractly, not historically, concretely, in her flesh, in her mind, in her heart. She was betrayed by her father, who declared her illegitimate, by her body that wouldn't produce the heir she needed, by her husband, who married her for England and left when she couldn't deliver, by her illness that killed her slowly while her enemies waited for their turn. She fought for legitimacy her entire life, for her mother's honour, for her faith, for her right to exist without apology. And she lost most of those fights, but she fought. That takes courage even when the cause was wrong. That requires strength even in failure. Mary Tudor wore a crown, but underneath it she was human, vulnerable, suffering, trying desperately to matter in a world that kept telling her she didn't. The phantom pregnancies weren't just personal tragedy. They rewrote England's political future in ways that are still visible today. Consider the Catholic Restoration's fragility. Mary had reconciled England with Rome. She'd restored church properties. She'd brought back Latin Mass and monastic life. She'd burned Protestant leaders and driven others into exile. For 5 years, Catholic England was possible. Not just possible, real. It was happening, but all of it depended on one thing: Mary producing a Catholic heir. Without that heir, the restoration was temporary. Everyone knew it. Catholic nobles investing in monastic properties knew they might lose everything when Elizabeth inherited. Priests re-establishing parishes knew they might be driven out again. Foreign powers supporting Mary's regime knew the alliance would collapse with her death. Everything rested on the child she couldn't produce. The phantom pregnancies exposed that fragility in the cruelest way. Twice England thought the succession was secure. Twice hope turned to humiliation. By the second failure, even Catholic loyalists understood. There would be no Catholic heir. Elizabeth would inherit. Everything Mary had accomplished had an expiration date written in her failing body. This opened the path for Elizabeth's religious settlement. When Elizabeth took the throne, she didn't have to fight for it. She walked into power unopposed because Mary's body had done the work of eliminating alternatives. No Catholic prince waiting in the wings, no disputed succession, just a clear line from Mary to Elizabeth that everyone accepted because there was no other option. Elizabeth's middle path, Protestantism, keeping bishops and ritual while rejecting papal authority, only worked because Mary's reign had exhausted England with extremism. The burnings had made people weary of religious persecution. The phantom pregnancies had made people skeptical of Catholic miracles. Elizabeth could position herself as the moderate alternative because Mary had been the radical. The dynastic stakes were constitutional. Tudor England's entire system of government depended on clear succession. Disputed successions meant civil war, chaos, foreign invasion. Henry VIII had torn England apart from Rome specifically to secure succession through a male heir. Mary's phantom pregnancies showed just how fragile that whole structure was. A woman's body, one woman's body, could derail everything. This influenced later English politics profoundly. When Elizabeth refused to marry or name an heir, Parliament panicked. They just lived through the nightmare of uncertain succession under Mary. They begged Elizabeth to marry, to produce children, to secure the line. She refused, and the fact that her refusal didn't destroy the kingdom was partly because she lived long enough and ruled successfully enough that by the time she died, the transition to James I was smooth, despite his Scottish origin. Mary's body became a constitutional hinge. The question of succession, of how royal reproduction intersected with state stability, was literally written in her failed pregnancies. Future monarchs would grapple with the same issues. Charles II's inability to produce legitimate heirs. George V's imported German dynasty. Victoria's 9 children used as diplomatic bargaining chips. The body of the monarch as vessel for the state itself. The quiet revolution of contingency. History doesn't move in straight lines. It pivots on accidents, on biological failures, on bodies that don't cooperate with political needs. If Mary had delivered a healthy son in 1555, England would have remained Catholic. The English Reformation would have been reversed. Shakespeare's plays would have been written in a Catholic kingdom. The entire trajectory of English literature, politics, and culture would have shifted, but her body couldn't. So history turned. The phantom pregnancies showed that for all the political theory about divine right and royal authority, everything could be undone by hormones and stress, and the mysterious ways a woman's reproductive system could fail. The grandest political ambitions, the most carefully laid plans, the alliances between great powers, all of it could collapse because one woman's pituitary gland misfired. Mary's phantom pregnancies proved that politics isn't just shaped by decisions and laws and armies, it's shaped by bodies, by biological imperatives that don't care about policy, by the fact that queens and kings are human animals subject to illness, infertility, and death. That power has to pass through flesh, and flesh is unreliable. England became Protestant not because of great military victories or theological debates or diplomatic triumphs. England became Protestant because Mary Tudor's body lied to her. Twice, and by the time the silence in the birthing chamber became undeniable, the future was already written. A queen waited for a child who never came, and a kingdom listened to the silence. Twice bells were prepared but never rung. Twice cradles sat empty. Mary Tudor's body betrayed her on the world stage, and when she died at 42, her Catholic restoration died with her. If you want more dark histories where the personal becomes political and bodies become battlegrounds, the next episode is waiting. Subscribe for stories that let curiosity rest without jolting you awake. Everything we know about Mary's phantom pregnancies comes from documents written by people who weren't her. That matters. Verified records exist. Ambassador dispatches from Venice, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire describing Mary's symptoms, the court's preparations, and the eventual non-births. These are contemporary accounts written by trained observers whose job was to report accurately. They're invaluable sources, proclamations announcing the pregnancies, official documents declaring that the Queen was with child, that celebrations should be prepared, that prayers should be offered. These prove the pregnancies were publicly acknowledged by Mary's government, not just rumour or posthumous invention. chronicles written during and immediately after Mary's reign. Some by Catholic sympathisers trying to explain what happened without making Mary look bad. Others by Protestant critics using the phantom pregnancies as evidence of divine judgment. Both biased, but from opposite directions. By comparing them, historians can triangulate probable truth, council records showing preparations for royal births, orders for supplies, payments to midwives, construction in the birthing chamber. These administrative documents confirm the physical reality of preparations, even if the birth never came. What's contested? The exact medical diagnosis? Was it pure pseudocyesis, an underlying tumour or cancer-causing symptoms, hormonal disruption from stress, multiple conditions working together? We can't know for certain. Medical descriptions from the 16th century use language we have to interpret. Swelling could mean many things. Retention of water could indicate various conditions. The symptom chronology is also debated. Different sources give different timelines for when symptoms appeared, when due dates were expected, when Mary entered confinement. Reconciling these accounts requires judgment calls about which sources are more reliable. Mary's own understanding of what was happening is completely unknown. Did she genuinely believe she was pregnant until the moment of failure? Did she harbour doubts she couldn't voice? Did she know on some level that her body was lying but couldn't admit it? We have no access to her interior experience, except through external observers' interpretations. The avoided speculation matters. Many historical accounts invented quotes for Mary that have no documentary basis. "When I'm dead, you'll find Calais written on my heart" is probably apocryphal. Emotional scenes of Mary weeping over her phantom pregnancies are imagined, not documented. Conversations with Philip about the failures are invented by chroniclers who weren't there. Historians must be careful not to retroactively diagnose with false certainty. We can say symptoms consistent with pseudocyesis and possibly ovarian cancer. We can't say definitively Mary had ovarian cancer because we don't have the evidence to support that level of certainty. The gap between probable and proven matters. We also can't assign neat motives. Why did Mary believe so strongly in the second pregnancy after the first had failed? Was it pure desperation? Genuine medical symptoms? Denial? All of the above? Human psychology is complex. Historical subjects deserve the same complexity we'd grant living people. How we weigh sources requires transparency. An ambassador reporting to his king is trying to be accurate, but also protecting his reputation. A chronicler writing after Mary's death is shaping narrative, not just reporting facts. Official proclamations reflect what the government wanted people to believe, not necessarily objective reality. Every source has biases that must be acknowledged. The unanswered questions matter for empathy and caution. We don't know exactly what Mary felt. We don't know precisely what Philip said to her in private. We don't know whether physicians genuinely believed the pregnancies were real, or whether they knowingly lied to avoid the Queen's wrath. These gaps remind us that history is always partial, always incomplete. What we can say with confidence, Mary Tudor experienced 2 episodes where she presented symptoms of pregnancy, made public announcements of pregnancy, underwent confinement rituals, and ultimately failed to deliver children. These episodes were psychologically devastating and politically catastrophic. They contributed to the end of Catholic England and the beginning of Elizabeth's Protestant reign. What we can't say, the precise medical mechanism, Mary's private thoughts, or exactly how she reconciled her faith with her body's betrayal. The gaps keep her human, unknowable in the ways humans always are.